In this video, I'm looking at Python, Flask, and WT forms, and I want to have a form that is going to not have a submit button. So I'm going to just have it's just going to have a numerical input, and then when the user changes something in the numerical input, then that's going to cause a post cause to have the same purpose as the submit the form. So I'm going to do that with a little bit of JavaScript. So let's just see this thing in action and then say how we got it. So Flask run and bring it up. And it's just a simple little form where there is a place to enter an integer. And it's just this, I'm going to make I'm going to call it a callouts chains. I'm going to, there's some game with numbers, dividing by 2 or multiplying by 3 and adding 1, and until you get down to 1. And I'm going to call that sequence of numbers a callouts chain, and then I want to, for the number, see the callouts chain. It's not that important, but what I really want to play with here is that I don't have a submit button, but when I change the value, when I do an input change in this number, then it's going to go to the server. So right now, this is some value that is being displayed in Jinja, and I'm going to change that value here. So there is my callouts chain for 65, and I'm generating this not in JavaScript. So if I view the page source, there's some JavaScript, but not that calculation, that generating that chain. That's not in the callouts, and that's not in the JavaScript. It could be, but it's not. So that is being done by Python on the server, but this is a little bit of JavaScript, which we will look at, because that's what is sort of making it that I don't need a submit button. So I don't have to change the number and then hit a submit button. I can just have some event that is not a submit button, but has the purpose of a submit button, forcing the form to submit. Okay, so here is, I have 2 Python files and an HTML file, and I probably also have a layout, another HTML file, and probably a style. So first thing here is I'm going to have my other file forms callouts, and I'm making callouts form, and that is, I'm extending the Flask form. I have an integer field, and I'm just going to require some input in there. So if they leave that sort of completely blank, I'm going to, I should not leave the form. And I'm calling that num. It's going to be an integer field. I have a label of enter number. I have a validator that it's required. I'm going to set the default number to be 64 to start with, and I'm going to add that there's, say, a minimum of 2. Okay, so that was the forms. That's more the WTF. Then here over on the Flask, handling the routes, my usual imports, my secret key, my default route redirect. Okay. Now here is my form, and if it's submitted, I will do stuff. Otherwise, let's look at the else. I just say we've only just begun is my chain HTML, and I do a render template and go to the page. Okay, so we saw that. Let's stop this and start it again. And we see in the beginning that we've only just begun. So that's when it's not submitted. Then once it's submitted, I just keep resubmitting it. So that was here. Now, if the form is submitted, then I am grabbing the information from the form. I'm getting from result num, I'm just calling it num again. And I'm making sure I understand that it's an integer, because usually what I get off of a form is a string. And then I start off my chain with that number again, but now I made it an integer, so now I'm putting it back into a string here with this format. And then I say, here's my call that stuff. It's just a while the number is greater than 1, or could say not equal to 1, getting the dividing it by 2 and finding the remainder, finding the modulus. And if it's divisible by 2, if num modulo 2 is equal to 0. So if it's an even number, I'm dividing the number by 2. This is this Collat's game. Otherwise, you take the number and you multiply by 3 and you add 1 and get a new number. And then I am adding 2 in this while. I'm adding 2 a chain. This is the HTML entity for a sort of a right arrow. So all those little right arrows, that's this. It's an HTML entity. I'm going to have to do something in Jinja to get the HTML entity to render. And so that just creates my chain. And then when the while loop is done, and that's what the callouts conjecture says, that while loop always does end. Then I'm going over to the page again with HTML, etc. Okay, so that is the game there in the app. So I've shown you the forms, I've shown you the app, and then let me show you the HTML. So I'm extending a simple layout, sort of what I standard do for these Flask, WTF, Python things. There's a title and a header I pass. Here's my form. Okay. Now it's going to be a post, and I'm giving it an ID. Okay. And I do my little CSRF token. I don't really think I need that here, but I just sort of tend to always do it, so I did it. Here is the div where I'm using the WTF, and I'm saying I want the label for my num, and then I want my num, which is an integer field. And then I have just this header that says callouts chain, and then I have here, again, curly curly, I have some Jinja. I can select, and if I want to format it as Jinja HTML, I can make that here and show off some of this, let's do some Jinja highlighting here. But after this header, then I have this chain HTML, which is a variable being passed over. And then I'm using Jinja to put it on the page. And I needed this word, again, what I was creating over here in the, what I was creating over here had HTML entities. And I don't want it to be ampersand, pound, some number, and a semicolon. I want that to be thought of, rendered as an HTML entity corresponding to the arrow. And so for that, I added this vertical bar safe in Jinja. So that let it say, like, okay, don't turn my ampersand into the HTML for an ampersand, but leave it as an ampersand within HTML, and then turn it into then an HTML entity. So that was sort of one interesting thing on the Jinja side. And then now the JavaScript to get the action, to get the posting to happen without a submit button. I usually do that by a submit button, and that's the purpose of the submit button. So it's just sort of understood. But now if I'm having something other than an input of the submit type thing gets rendered as a button, if I want something else to do my post, to do my submit, then I have to work a little harder. And that little extra work here is in this JavaScript. So here is my script. Again, I'm putting that inside my block content because I'm extending a layout. So I have to put it in some block for it to be placed ultimately on the HTML page, which is extending simple layout. Okay. So I am going to the document. This is JavaScript now. Document get element by ID num. So when I called it over here, num, when it gets rendered, when WT forms is rendering this integer field, it will give an input of the number type, because it's an integer field. It'll be an input of the number type, and it will give it the name of num, and that's for purposes of the server interaction, and it will also give it an ID of num. So let's look at view the page source. And here is the input, and it gave it an ID of num and a name of num. So I can play with it here when I want to get on the server side, when I want to get what the user put in there. I call it num. That's based on the name attribute. But over here, when I'm doing some JavaScript and I want to do it, then I refer to it by the ID. So it gave it both an ID of num and a name of num. So I'm going to the document, to the page, getting the element by ID called num. I called it num input. I'm doing the add an event listener. So this is some element. If the element I want to listen to an event for that listener, I'm choosing the input event, which is what I usually use for where somebody can type text or type a number or something like that. And this should handle both the little sort of up-down arrow as well as the user just sort of typing. And then that event is going to be handled by this anonymous function that will follow immediately. And we are going to the page, finding the element with the ID of form callouts, which again, I gave the form an ID of form callouts. So I named it, so I know that was its name. And I am doing the dot submit. So that's calling the post and taking the information up to the server and so on. So that's what I wanted to show you, sort of this idea of adding a little bit of JavaScript. So then I could get this submit action without the submit field, without the input button. All right, that's what I'm going to show you on this one. Thanks for your attention.